The town of Adupe was always busy. Its market square was the heart of the city, filled with traders shouting out their goods, children running around, and women bargaining for the best prices. Life in Adupe was simple, but the people took pride in their appearance. For many, fashion was more than just clothing. It was a way to earn respect and admiration. In one corner of the market stood a shop that everyone was talking about, Grace's wig shop. Grace, the owner, was a quiet and soft-spoken woman in her late 20s. She was beautiful, with smooth skin and shiny hair that made her look like she belonged in a big city. Even though she didn't talk much, her presence was hard to ignore. Grace's wigs were the best anyone had ever seen. The hair was so soft and smooth that it felt like it was alive. Women said the wigs looked even better than natural hair. Whether it was long, curly styles or simple straight ones, Grace's wigs had a way of making women look and feel more confident. It wasn't just the women of Adupe who bought Grace's wigs. People came from nearby villages, some traveling for hours just to buy one. Those who wore her wigs said they felt like new people. Men stared at them in admiration, and women wanted to know their secret. The wigs were expensive, but people were willing to save up just to own one. She must have some special supplier. One customer whispered to another. Where else would she get such perfect hair? Maybe she's just very talented, the other replied. Whatever it is, her wigs are magic. Despite her growing fame and wealth, Grace kept her life private. Nobody knew much about her family or her past. Some said she had come from another town, while others believed she was just secretive by nature. She's so quiet, people would say. You would think someone as successful as Grace would talk more about herself. But she doesn't. But Grace didn't seem to mind the whispers. She focused on her shop, greeting her customers with a small smile and quietly handing over their wigs. To the people of Adupe, Grace was a mystery, beautiful, rich, and talented. In the same Adupe market where Grace's shop stood, there were two other wig sellers, Linda and Mary. They had been in the business for years, long before Grace arrived in town. Back then, Linda and Mary were the queens of the wig trade. Their shops were always busy, and their profits were steady. But things had changed. Since Grace opened her shop, Linda and Mary's customers have reduced drastically. Their once busy shops now sat nearly empty, while women flocked to Grace's. It wasn't just the numbers that bothered them, it was the praise Grace received. Her wigs are so smooth, one woman had said. I've never seen anything like them. Mine didn't even tangle after washing, another added. Linda and Mary couldn't stand hearing those comments. It was as if all the years they had spent building their businesses meant nothing now. The jealousy began to eat away at them. One afternoon, Linda visited Mary's shop, her face tight with frustration. I don't understand it, Linda said, pacing back and forth. How can she be so successful in such a short time? We've been here for years and now we're the ones struggling. Mary, sitting by the door, crossed her arms. It's not natural, she replied. No one can get hair that perfect without some kind of secret. Have you felt her wigs? They're different. Linda stopped pacing and turned to Mary. What do you mean? I'm saying there's something odd about them, Mary said, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear. Her supplier must have access to unusual materials. Linda frowned. Unusual? Like what? Mary shrugged. I don't know. But doesn't it bother you that she never talks about where she gets her hair? And have you noticed how she never mingles with anyone outside her shop? The two women sat in silence for a moment, the seeds of suspicion taking root. Mary broke the silence first. What if her wigs don't come from a normal supplier? What if there's something abnormal about them? Linda leaned closer. What are you trying to say? I'm just saying, Mary continued, people don't rise this fast without help. And if it's not natural talent, then maybe it's something else, something we don't understand. The next day, Mary began spreading whispers in the market. She would casually mention to customers that Grace's wigs were too perfect, or that she didn't trust someone who never explained where her materials came from. Linda, though hesitant at first, joined in. Have you ever wondered where Grace gets her hair? Linda asked one woman at her shop. It's strange, isn't it? No one else has wigs like hers. Slowly, the rumors began to spread. Some dismissed them as baseless jealousy. Mary sat in her shop, staring at the shelves. It had been another dry day. Not a single customer had walked through her door, and her heart felt heavy. As she packed up for the evening, her eyes caught something that sent a jolt of anger through her. Across the street, one of her regular customers was stepping out of Grace's shop, holding a glossy new wig and smiling from ear to ear. Mary couldn't believe it. That woman had always been loyal to her. She dropped the broom she was holding and hurried across the street. "Margaret!" Mary called out, stopping the woman in her tracks. The customer turned, looking startled. "Oh, Mary, good evening." "What are you doing there?" Mary asked, her voice sharp. "I thought you always bought your wigs from me." Margaret hesitated, clutching the bag holding her new wig. "I just wanted to try something different," she finally said. "Everyone's talking about Grace's wigs and, well, all my friends get theirs from her. They said her wigs are just better." Mary felt like she'd been slapped. She didn't know whether to cry or yell. Without another word, she turned and marched back to her shop, slamming the door behind her. Inside, Mary sat down heavily. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and angry all at once. She couldn't let Grace continue to steal her customers, but what could she do? Then a thought came to her, one that made her shiver and yet filled her with determination. "If I can't figure out what makes her wig so special, I'll never survive in this market," she whispered to herself. "I need to find out her secret, no matter what it takes." That night, Mary decided to follow Grace. She waited in the shadows outside Grace's shop, watching and waiting. Around midnight, the door opened and Grace stepped out, carrying a mysterious bundle wrapped in cloth. Mary's heart pounded as she saw Grace glance around, then head toward the outskirts of the town. Mary followed carefully, staying far enough behind to avoid being seen. Grace walked with purpose, her steps leading her to the banks of the river that bordered Adupe. Mary crouched behind a tree, her curiosity turning into unease as she watched Grace kneel by the water's edge. The scene that unfolded next made Mary's blood run cold. Grace began chanting in a language Mary didn't recognize. The river seemed to respond, its surface glowing with an eerie blue light. As Grace's chant grew louder, a figure began to emerge from the water, a shimmering, ethereal woman with flowing hair and piercing eyes. Mary bit her lip to keep from gasping. The figure was beautiful but terrifying, her presence radiating power. Mary realized she was looking at a spirit, the Marine Queen of legend. "Your offerings have pleased me," the spirit said, her voice like the wind. "Bring me more, and I shall continue to bless your craft." Grace bowed her head. "Thank you, my queen. I will remain loyal to you." The spirit gestured toward the river, and strands of hair began rising from the water, floating toward Grace. Mary's eyes widened as she recognized the source of the hair. It came from the spirits of those who had drowned in the river. Grace carefully added the strands to the bundle she carried, treating them with reverence. As Mary watched, her thoughts spun. Grace had made a pact with this spirit to gain wealth and success. The perfect wigs she sold were laced with something unthinkable: the hair of lost souls. Mary knew this secret could ruin Grace, but it would also change everything. What had started as a mission to save her business now felt like something much darker. Mary's heart pounded as she tiptoed away from the riverbank. Her mind raced with the horrifying scene she had just witnessed. Grace's pact with the Marine Queen and the source of her wigs were beyond anything Mary had imagined. She had to leave before Grace noticed her. But just as she turned to sneak back toward the town, a sharp pain exploded in the back of her head. Everything went black. When Mary opened her eyes, she was lying on the damp ground. Her head throbbed, and she felt weak. She tried to sit up, but a figure loomed over her. It was Grace, holding a heavy wooden staff. Her expression was cold, and her usually calm demeanor was gone. "You couldn't mind your business, could you?" Grace said, her voice dripping with anger. "You just had to follow me." Mary tried to speak, but her throat felt dry. She could only manage a weak, "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," Grace interrupted. "This isn't some petty market rivalry. You've bitten off more than you can chew, Mary." Grace leaned closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "You saw things you shouldn't have. Now you'll face the consequences." Before Mary could respond, another wave of dizziness overtook her, and she blacked out again. The next morning, Adupa was abuzz with shocking news. Mary's lifeless body had been found in the bush. Her face was pale, her eyes wide open as if frozen in fear, and her body was sprawled unnaturally, as though she had been tossed aside. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. Vendors and traders gathered in small groups, whispering and speculating. "How could this happen?" someone asked. "Mary was just at the market yesterday." Linda was among the crowd, her brows furrowed as she listened. She couldn't believe it. Mary might have been a rival, but her sudden death felt too strange to be a coincidence. Linda had seen how angry Mary was the day before. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her. Later that day, Linda visited Mary's shop, hoping to find some answers. The door was locked, and everything looked as if Mary had simply vanished. Linda's heart sank as she thought about their last conversation. Mary had been bitter, jealous, and determined to uncover Grace's secret. As the days passed, Linda grew more uneasy. She began to piece together the strange events, the rumors Mary had spread, her sudden anger, and now her death. Linda felt there had to be a connection between Mary's death and Grace, but every time she tried to bring it up, people dismissed her concerns. "You're overthinking this," one vendor told her. "Mary's death was unfortunate, but it doesn't mean anything." Another added, "Grace's wigs are the best in Adup. I've used them for months, and nothing strange has happened to me." Despite their dismissal, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And Linda couldn't ignore the lingering unease. She decided to keep her suspicions to herself, for now. But deep down, Linda knew that Mary's death was no accident, and the truth behind Grace's wigs was darker than anyone in Adup could imagine. A few weeks had passed since Mary's death, and life in Adup seemed to have returned to normal. The market buzzed with activity once more, and vendors called out their wares as if nothing had happened. Whispers about Mary's mysterious end had faded, replaced by the usual gossip about who wore the finest clothes and who hosted the best parties. In the midst of it all, Grace's business continued to thrive. If anything, her popularity had only grown. Her wigs were still the most sought after, and she seemed unaffected by the tragedy that had unsettled the market only weeks earlier. She began offering online wig-making courses for those eager to learn the art of wig craftsmanship. It was the perfect setup for her. She could share knowledge while keeping her real secrets to herself. No one worked with her directly. All interactions were virtual. Among her new students was a woman named Sarah, a fashion enthusiast from a nearby town. Sarah was eager to learn everything she could from Grace, hoping it might lead to a mentorship opportunity. While teaching online, Grace was also working on something new. She had announced the launch of her Bone Straight collection, a line of wigs she described as the most luxurious yet. The hair was long, sleek and lush, with a shine that seemed almost unnatural. The wigs were priced higher than anything she had sold before, targeting only the wealthiest clients, the so-called crème de la crème. To promote the new collection, Grace organized an exclusive event, inviting only those who had already purchased from the Bone Straight line. It was a private affair, held at an upscale venue just outside Adup. Sarah, eager to see Grace in person, ordered a wig from the collection despite its steep price. A few days later, she received both her wig and an invitation to the event. On the evening of the event, Sarah arrived dressed in her finest. The party was lavish, with beautiful decorations, soft music, and finely dressed guests mingling over cocktails. Grace moved through the crowd like a queen, her every step exuding confidence and control. When Sarah finally approached Grace, she was both nervous and excited. "Your wigs are incredible," Sarah said. "That's why I joined your course. But I was wondering, would you consider taking me on as an apprentice? I would love to learn from you directly." Grace's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Thank you, Sarah, but I don't take apprentices. My courses are the best way to learn from me." Sarah looked disappointed but managed a polite nod. "I understand, thank you." As the night drew to a close, Sarah said her goodbyes and headed for the exit. While walking to her car, she noticed something strange, a woman lurking in the shadows near the venue. Sarah paused, squinting in the dim light. It was Linda, standing at a distance, watching the event. Who is that and what is she doing hiding like that? Sarah murmured to herself. Inside, Grace's sharp eyes had also caught sight of Linda. She frowned, her intuition telling her something wasn't right. Linda had been acting strange ever since Mary's death, and now, seeing her outside the private event, Grace felt uneasy. She didn't like loose ends, and Linda's curiosity was starting to feel like a problem. A week after the exclusive event, Sarah sat quietly in her room, staring at the sleek, bone-straight wig she had purchased from Grace's collection. Her fingers ran through its smooth strands, but her thoughts were far from admiration. She hadn't bought the wig for its beauty. She had a deeper reason for getting close to Grace. Sarah was more than just an eager wig enthusiast. She was Mary's younger sister and the wife of Pastor Benjamin, a respected clergyman in their town. Since Mary's sudden and mysterious death, Sarah had been unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mary had been healthy and determined, yet her life had ended so abruptly. God, if there's something to this, show me. She thought about all the oddities surrounding Grace, the secrecy, her meteoric rise in the wig business, and Mary's fixation on exposing her. Grace seemed untouchable, her charm and reputation shielding her from any real scrutiny. And now, with Sarah enrolled in Grace's online course and attending her event, she felt like she was tiptoeing into dangerous territory. Despite her efforts to stay quiet, Sarah knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who might understand her suspicions, and she could think of only one person. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Linda's shop just as the market was starting to come alive. Linda looked up in surprise when she saw Sarah walk in. "Good morning," Linda said, a bit wary. She recognized Sarah from the event but didn't know why she was there now. Sarah closed the door behind her and hesitated before speaking. "Can we talk? Privately?" Linda raised an eyebrow but nodded, gesturing to a stool near the counter. "What's on your mind?" "I know we don't know each other well," Sarah began, her voice low, "but I think you're the only person who might understand what I'm about to say." Linda leaned forward, curious. "Go on." Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm Mary's younger sister." Linda's eyes widened. "Mary? As in—" She trailed off, her voice faltering. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "And I think her death wasn't just some random tragedy." Linda's face tightened. She had suspected something was wrong too, but she had kept her doubts to herself. "What are you saying?" "I've been trying to figure out what happened to her," Sarah continued. "Mary told me once about how upset she was over losing her customers to Grace. She mentioned following Grace one night, but she didn't tell me why. And then, she was gone." Linda swallowed hard, her heart racing. "I had my own suspicions," she admitted, "but every time I brought it up, people told me I was just jealous of Grace. They didn't want to hear it." Sarah nodded grimly. "It's the same for me. Everyone sees Grace as this perfect businesswoman. They think anything bad said about her is just jealousy." For a moment, the two women sat in silence, their shared frustration filling the room. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been keeping quiet because I don't have any proof, and the more I talk, the more I sound like I'm grasping at straws. But I can't shake the feeling that Grace is hiding something." Linda stared at Sarah. She had always felt there was something off about Grace, but hearing Mary's sister confirm her own doubts made her stomach churn. "So what do we do?" Linda asked. "If no one will believe us, how do we prove anything?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know yet. But I think the answer lies with Grace. If we watch her closely, maybe we'll find something that connects her to Mary's death." Linda nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll keep our eyes open. And if there's anything to find, we'll find it." As Sarah left Linda's shop, she felt a small glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. She wasn't alone anymore. Whatever Grace's secret was, she and Linda would uncover it, no matter how long it took. But as Sarah walked through the bustling market, a strange feeling crept over her, as though someone was watching her. She glanced around but saw nothing unusual. Shaking off her unease, she hurried home, unaware that Grace had already started to grow suspicious. Sarah sat bolt upright in bed, gasping for air. Her heart raced, and she felt as though she had been underwater for hours. She clutched her chest, her body trembling. It was the third night in a row she had had the same dream, a terrifying vision of being pulled into the depths of a dark, endless river. In her dream, she was always surrounded by ghostly figures, their hair flowing unnaturally in the current. They reached for her, their faces twisted in silent screams, and just as she felt herself being dragged under, she would wake up. Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Pastor Benjamin stirred beside her, his voice groggy. "Sarah, what's wrong? Another bad dream?" "Yes," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "It feels so real. It's always the same. Drowning, the river, those figures." Benjamin sat up, his face serious. He took her hand in his. "This isn't just a bad dream, Sarah. It could be a warning. Tell me everything." Sarah hesitated, then began recounting the strange feelings she had had since Mary's death, her suspicions about Grace, and her dreams. Benjamin listened intently. "We can't ignore this," he said when she finished. "If what you're saying is true, then something spiritual is at play here. Grace may be hiding more than just a business secret. What should we do?" Sarah asked. Benjamin took a deep breath. "We need to pray, but we also need answers. I'll gather some of the men from church." Pastor Benjamin led a small group of trusted church members toward the riverbank. Each man carried a lantern and wore an expression of determination. Sarah had told them everything she knew, and though some were skeptical, they trusted their pastor's judgment. The group arrived at the river just as the night grew still. The water's surface was calm, reflecting the pale light of the moon. Benjamin instructed everyone to stay quiet as they hid among the tall grasses near the shore. Hours passed, and the men began to grow restless. But just as some were about to give up, they saw her. Grace appeared at the edge of the river, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. She looked around cautiously, her movements tense. Satisfied that she was alone, she knelt by the water and began to chant. The men watched in stunned silence as the river seemed to come alive. Its surface began to glow with an eerie blue light, and a mist rose around Grace, shrouding her in a ghostly haze. "What's she doing?" one man whispered, but Benjamin raised a hand to silence him. As the chant grew louder, the water churned violently, and a figure began to emerge. The Marine Queen rose from the depths, her presence otherworldly and terrifying. Her long hair shimmered like silver threads, and her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "You have done well," the Queen said, her voice echoing as though it came from the river itself. "Your offerings are acceptable." Grace bowed deeply. "Thank you, my Queen. I will continue to bring you what you require." The group could hardly believe their eyes. One of the men crossed himself, his hands shaking. Benjamin, however, stood firm. He motioned for the others to stay hidden as he continued to watch. The Queen reached out, and from the depths of the river, strands of hair began to rise. They floated toward Grace, shimmering with an unearthly beauty. Grace carefully added the hair to her bundle. As the Queen began to sink back into the water, Benjamin whispered, "Now." The group emerged from their hiding place, their lanterns cutting through the darkness. Grace spun around, her eyes wide with shock. For the first time, her calm facade cracked. "Grace," Benjamin called out, "your wickedness is exposed. No longer will you deceive this town with your lies and evil practices." Grace clutched her bundle tightly, backing away from the group. "You don't understand," she shouted. "This is beyond you." But Benjamin stepped forward, his voice steady. "We serve a higher power, Grace. You cannot stand against the truth." The river seemed to react to Benjamin's words, its glow dimming as the Queen disappeared beneath the surface. Grace stood frozen, her face a mask of fear and defiance. "We must leave now," Benjamin said to his group. "This is not over." As they retreated from the riverbank, Sarah's heart raced. She knew they had uncovered something dark and dangerous, but the battle was far from finished. Grace paced back and forth in her small home, her mind racing after the night's encounter with Pastor Benjamin and his group. Her heart pounded with fear, but her resolve hardened. She knew the risks of dealing with the Marine Queen, but she had always been careful to keep her secrets hidden. Grace knelt in front of her altar, a small shrine adorned with items she had collected from the river. She lit a candle and began chanting, calling out to the Marine Queen for guidance. The air in the room grew heavy, and a cold breeze swept through as the Queen appeared, her shimmering form hovering over the altar. "You have been careless, Grace," the Marine Queen said, her voice sharp and cutting. "You allowed them to see too much. If you are exposed further, you will face the consequences alone." Grace's knees buckled under the weight of the Queen's words. "But my Queen, they have no proof," she said, her voice trembling. "I can still turn this around." The Queen's eyes narrowed. "Fortify yourself then. But remember this, your power comes from me. If you fail to keep my secrets, you will pay the price." Grace nodded, determined. "I won't let you down." The Queen vanished, leaving the room silent. Grace gathered the items needed for her fortification ritual. She chanted over a mixture of river water and herbs, rubbing it over her skin as she called on the Marine Queen to strengthen her. When she finished, she felt a surge of confidence and power. The fear she had felt earlier melted away. "They can't touch me," she said aloud, a smirk playing on her lips. "Not the pastor, not anyone. And if they try, I'll deal with them like I dealt with Mary." Meanwhile, Linda's world was crumbling. She had spent weeks trying to uncover Grace's secrets, but nothing could have prepared her for the betrayal she discovered that morning. Her fiancé, Daniel, had been acting distant lately, and Linda decided to confront him. What she found shattered her heart. Daniel was having an affair with Grace. Linda felt sick as she pieced together the truth. Grace's charm, her beauty, her wealth, it had all lured Daniel away. When she confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. "Linda," he said coldly, "Grace has more to offer than you ever could." Linda's heart broke. "More to offer," she repeated, her voice shaking. "What does that even mean? I thought we were building a life together." Daniel shrugged. "Grace has power, Linda. She's not just some market woman. You can't compete with that." Tears streamed down Linda's face as Daniel walked away, leaving her alone with her anger and heartbreak. But as the pain subsided, a new resolve took its place. If Grace thought she could ruin Linda's life and get away with it, she was wrong. "I will expose you, Grace," Linda muttered through clenched teeth. "I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." The next market day, Linda made her move. She waited until Grace's shop was at its busiest, with women crowding around to buy her bone-straight wigs. Linda marched into the shop, her face flushed with anger. "Grace!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chatter. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Grace glanced up, startled but quickly regaining her composure. "Linda," she said coolly, "what's the meaning of this?" Linda pointed a shaking finger at Grace. "I know what you are," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're no businesswoman. You're a fraud, and worse, you're dangerous." Gasps erupted from the crowd and whispers spread like wildfire. Grace's calm expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Linda, this is ridiculous. You're making a fool of yourself." "Am I?" Linda shot back. "Tell them, Grace. Tell them where you really get your wigs from. Tell them what you've done to people like Mary." The mention of Mary's name caused a stir among the customers. Grace's eyes narrowed and her voice grew cold. "You don't know what you're talking about." Linda stepped closer, her voice rising. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you think you can get away with it, you're wrong. Everyone will know the truth about you, Grace." At that moment, Grace knew she had to act fast and do something about Linda and her loud mouth before it got too late. Grace sat in her dimly lit shop, her hands clenched into fists. Linda's public accusations had spread like wildfire through a dupe. Though some dismissed them as jealousy, others began to wonder if there was truth to the claims. Grace could feel the cracks forming in the carefully crafted image she had spent years building. "She dared to humiliate me," Grace muttered, her voice low and seething. "She'll regret it." That night, Grace returned to her altar and lit the candles she used for her darkest rituals. Calling on the Marine Queen, she poured out her frustration and fury. "She's a threat to me," Grace said, her voice trembling with anger. "Give me the power to silence her for good." The Marine Queen's voice echoed through the room, cold and distant. "You are walking a dangerous path, Grace. You must tread carefully." "I don't care," Grace snapped. "Just give me what I need." The Marine Queen's warning faded, and Grace felt the familiar rush of dark energy flowing through her. That night, Linda was plagued by horrific nightmares. She dreamed of drowning, her lungs burning as cold, ghostly hands dragged her into a bottomless river. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. This continued for days, leaving Linda shaken and afraid. She began to feel as though an unseen force was following her, haunting her every move. In desperation, she sought out Sarah. Linda arrived at Sarah's home one morning, her face pale and her eyes tired from lack of sleep. Sarah immediately ushered her inside. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, concerned. "It's Grace," Linda said, her voice trembling. "Ever since I confronted her, I've been having nightmares. They feel so real, Sarah, I don't know what to do." Sarah's expression darkened. She knew firsthand the kind of power Grace was wielding, and she could see that Linda was being targeted. "You did the right thing by coming here," Sarah said firmly. "You're not alone in this. My husband and I will help you." Sarah called her husband, Pastor Benjamin, explaining the situation. He listened carefully and agreed that it was time to confront Grace directly. That evening, Benjamin gathered a small group of trusted church members and armed them with the most powerful weapon they had: faith. "We will confront Grace," Benjamin said, "but we must pray and prepare ourselves. This is not a battle of flesh and blood." The group spent hours in prayer, asking for divine protection and strength. They recited Bible verses, calling on God to break every chain of darkness and expose the truth. As the moon rose, the group made their way to Grace's shop. Inside, Grace was performing another ritual, sensing that something was coming. Her confidence had returned since fortifying herself, and she felt invincible. When the group arrived, Pastor Benjamin knocked on the door. Grace opened it, her expression cold. "What do you want?" she demanded. Benjamin stepped forward, holding a Bible in one hand. "We are here to expose the darkness, Grace. Your time of deceiving this town is over." Grace laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can stop me? You don't know who you're dealing with." The confrontation escalated as Benjamin and the group began praying and quoting Bible verses. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world," Benjamin said, his voice steady. Grace's demeanor began to crack. She tried to fight back, chanting and calling on the Marine Queen for help. But as the group's prayers grew louder, a strange energy filled the room. The candles on Grace's altar flickered and went out, and a chilling wind swept through the shop. "Stop this!" Grace shouted, her voice desperate, but the power she relied on was slipping away. Sarah joined in, reciting scripture with conviction. "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it," she declared. Grace fell to her knees, clutching her head as if in pain. Her true nature began to show. Her eyes turned a haunting shade of green, and her voice became distorted. The dark power she had hidden for so long was laid bare for everyone to see. The Marine Queen's voice echoed faintly in the room. "You are on your own now, Grace." Realizing she had been abandoned, Grace screamed, her composure shattered. The pastor and his group continued their prayers, and with one final cry, Grace collapsed, defeated. The room fell silent, and the oppressive darkness lifted. The townspeople who had gathered outside peered in, shocked to see the mighty Grace brought to her knees. Pastor Benjamin turned to the crowd. "The truth is exposed," he said. "Let this be a lesson. No darkness can stand against the light of God." As Grace lay collapsed in her shop, trembling and defeated, Sarah stepped forward. She had been quiet throughout the confrontation, letting her husband and the prayer group lead the charge. But now, with Grace exposed and powerless, Sarah couldn't hold back any longer. Grace looked up at Sarah with hollow eyes, her strength gone. Why did you do this to me?" she muttered. Sarah's voice was steady but filled with pain. "Do you even realize what you've done? The lives you've destroyed, the innocent people you've lured to their deaths, including my sister." Grace blinked in confusion. Your sister? Yes, Mary, Sarah said, her voice rising. She was my sister. You ended her life because she discovered your secret, and now you ask why. You'll answer for everything you've done, Grace. Every innocent life you've ended. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but she stood firm, refusing to let her emotions overwhelm her. Grace's head hung low, her silence acknowledging the weight of her guilt. The townspeople outside murmured, shocked by Sarah's revelation. Many had thought Mary's death was an accident, but now they understood the darkness that had lingered in their town for so long. In the days that followed, Grace's shop became a symbol of the evil that had plagued Adupe. Under Pastor Benjamin's guidance, the townspeople gathered to cleanse the space. They tore down the shelves, burned the wigs, and prayed over the market, asking for God's protection against any lingering darkness. Grace was taken into custody by the local authorities. The charges against her were vague, as much of her wrongdoings were spiritual and not easily explained in legal terms. But the police knew she was a danger to the community and kept her locked away while they investigated further. 3 days after her arrest, the news shocked Adupe once again. Grace had been found dead in her cell. The cause of death was drowning, an impossibility considering there was no water in the cell. The guards reported hearing strange sounds during the night, like rushing water, but dismissed it as their imagination. By morning, Grace was gone. The people of Adupe were both horrified and relieved. They saw her death as divine judgment, a final end to the dark forces that had controlled her life. The Marine Queen's hold over her had ultimately led to her destruction. In the weeks that followed, Pastor Benjamin, Sarah, and Linda worked tirelessly to restore hope and faith in the community. They organized outreach programs and prayer meetings, encouraging people to stay vigilant and prayerful. Evil thrives in secrecy, Pastor Benjamin often said, but no power is above God. When we stand together in faith, darkness cannot overcome us. Linda, now free from the heartbreak and turmoil that Grace had caused, channeled her energy into rebuilding her business. With the community's support, her wig shop flourished once again, but she never forgot the lessons she had learned. Sarah, too, found healing through her work with the church. She often spoke to women about the importance of discernment and the dangers of envy and greed. We must never forget, she would say, that true beauty and success come from within, not from shortcuts or dark paths.